Today's lecture will be about measurement of innovation. We've talked about this issue several times, and we're going to explore this in a little bit more detail in today's lecture. And we'll talk about some methods of innovation, or more specifically about ideation. So, now we're focusing on innovation measurement, methods of innovation. We'll talk about brainstorming, TRIZ, and empathy. So let's start talking about some questions. How do you measure innovation, and what is your preferred method of innovation? Anyone want to start?
Professor,
Yes?
measuring innovation, we talked about like by measuring the patents, like how many patents you have.
Yeah. Okay, so that's one method, but it doesn't really capture the whole aspect of innovation. Any other thoughts by other students?
Professor, what about the success, the percentage of sales, of annual sales of particular innovation?
Yeah, so that's actually outcomes. So Tayal had mentioned about patents, and that kind of was the input to innovation. And Sergey is talking about sales, or the output for innovation. Any other thoughts?
So maybe it's not only about the output, but it's also like looking at the process, the operational process of innovation that the company produces. Does the operational process really?
Yeah, so that's actually very good. So I really like the answers. Tayal talked about inputs, Sergey talked about outputs, and Clarissa talks about the process. So that's very interesting. Does your company, if we wanted to measure GE, or we wanted to measure Tesla, or we wanted to measure Siemens, or we wanted to measure Google, we can look at the inputs, we can look at the outputs, we can look at how their procedures and their process and their organizational structure. So these are all different measures of innovation. Uh, let's go to the next question. What is your preferred method of innovation? So what would you do to improve these inputs? What would you do to improve these outputs? What would you do to improve the process? Any thoughts? What about Veronica Dubrova? What do you think? What is your preferred method of innovation? Let's say your boss tells you to innovate. What would you start to do?
Mm, Let me think.
You want to think a little bit about
Yes,
that?
yes.
Okay. What about Mikkel Hansen? Mikkel Hansen, what do you say?
Well, first of all, I would probably, get a lot of people together so we can do the whole cultivation thing you talked about before, right?
Yeah, so the variety and variability of
Exactly.
ideas, right?
Yeah.
So that's one aspect. That's correct. That's a good idea. What about Kim Baek Chun? Kim Baek Chun, what do you say? Kim Baek Chun. Okay. What about Elza Hozalian?
Yes, Professor. Good morning.
Good morning. So what is your preferred method of innovation?
I would say probably the measure of innovation, probably the amount of uh, innovations made by someone or made by company. That would be
So
the
that would
measure.
be the measure of innovation, but what is your preferred method of innovation?
Oh, method.
Yeah, method. Second question, sorry.
The method of innovation would be maybe like to get inspiration for the method of innovation, to get inspiration for some innovative ideas, and that would be the method of innovation. Sorry, I just can't really answer the question.
Okay. So let's go back to Veronica. Any thoughts?
So you're saying in the working, right? The method
Yes.
of innovation. So I agree with the first speaker, like gathering the ideas, like identifying
Gathering the ideas, right?
the solution, and then yeah, kind of like gathering the ideas together and thinking how to solve this.
Okay, so let me frame this a little bit differently. So remember this theory of innovation that I've been presenting of hereditability or to exchange ideas, variability to generate different ideas, and number three, to test the ideas. So any kind of preferred method of innovation should emphasize or optimize or increase those three elements: communication, variety, and testing. So we're going to talk about some methods of innovation, but they're not all necessarily satisfactory, and they touch upon different aspects of this approach to innovation. So let's continue. Sorry. So now we're in this section. So we'll do a very quick review. We already did this. We talked about use-oriented research, fundamental research, and the different categories. We talked about Einstein and how he is influenced by real problems. We talked about the fourth industrial revolution and the importance of technology convergence. We mentioned that innovation is the only true way to create value, to stay away from that equilibrium sort of point of classical economics. Creates different kinds of innovation projects or portfolio. We talked about megatrends and the importance of aligning with megatrends and the different types of megatrends. We discussed closed versus open innovation. And now we're going to talk about measurement of innovation. So we can measure innovation either quantitatively in terms of numbers. So for example, a number of patents that Tayal mentioned. Clarissa mentioned the process. Sergey mentioned the ROI. So those would be quantitative measures of innovation. We can also measure innovation qualitatively. So in terms of the culture, participant stories, social media engagement, what are the learnings in terms of the process, prototypes that generated, success stories, learnings, etc., in terms of the returns and final outcomes. These are different ways to measure innovation, but there is no real comprehensive measurement of innovation. We measured innovation in the Boost study, for example, by a qualitative approach, by interviewing executives and asking for their opinion, both in general as well as specific aspects of innovation. So in terms of methods of innovation, as Mikhail mentioned, bringing people together, and we call this brainstorming. There are different frameworks to assist in brainstorming. One of them is mind maps. The other one is fishbone diagrams. Third one is flowcharts, SWOT analysis, starbursting. Last week's lecture that I recorded for you was a starbursting approach to look at globalization and global mindset, which Clarissa mentioned, affinity diagrams, and concept maps. These are different methods of brainstorming, which is exactly what Mikhail mentioned, bringing people together to share and uncover new ideas. But then the question is, how do we do that? Just gathering people together. It's good to have a framework to do that. So mind maps are a tool to visualize and organize information. So let's say you want to go on a vacation. You might organize the information of that vacation in terms of transportation, activities, location, people, and accommodation. So that would be a mind map of your vacation. And then you can ideate, well, what location? Well, Tuscany, we go to Florence, and what dates and so forth. Who should be involved? We bring in, the family. Where should we stay? Airbnb, hotel, under a bridge, things like that. And then how do we get there? Where do we travel? What's our transportation options? And then the activities, what activities will we do? And then ideate. So you create a mind map to visualize and organize information. Extremely important approach to brainstorming. Now, there's a very interesting principle called the Anna Karenina principle. Anna Karenina, as most of you know, is a novel written by Leo Tolstoy. It's actually my favorite novel of Leo Tolstoy. And the Anna Karenina principle says that happy families are all alike. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. That's the opening lines to Anna Karenina. Now, why do I include this quote in a discussion of brainstorming? Well, the whole idea of brainstorming is to come up with different ideas. And usually when we are looking for an outcome or a result, we are looking for a happy result. We want to have a successful product. We want to have a powerful business model. We want to have a strong, profitable company. That would be happy family. But happy families are all alike. They all have characteristics of, being together, enjoying time together, not having conflict. Happy families have a certain uniformity to them. But unhappy families are unhappy in different ways, which means that the negative result is often more diverse than the positive result. So if we're aiming for a great product, but we want to come up with different products, we want to come up with different ideas, we want to actually think of the negative situation. So a powerful way to do brainstorming is a fishbone diagram or reverse brainstorming. So instead of finding the solution to a problem, you wonder how to cause the problem, or how to achieve the opposite result of what you expect. So let's say you want to create a company that creates excellent hamburgers. Well, you think about a fishbone diagram of what would result in bad hamburgers. So you can have materials, methods, machines, environment, measurements, personnel that create bad hamburgers. So unhygienic packaging, the recipe is bad, the food is mishandled, the spices are incorrect quantity, the humidity makes the food, the bread soggy. You think of all the negative or unhappy uh, aspects, and that can be a way of then innovating to create ideas to create the good outcome. So our natural tendency is to think of the positive outcome, but forcing us to think about the negative outcome is a very powerful way to innovate. So this is actually very important, because one of the aspects of innovation is it's unnatural, it's not comfortable. And so creating a level of discomfort is a very important incentive to ideation. Another form of brainstorming is a flow chart. Flow charts describe, as you know, the relationship between uh, different processes in time in a algorithmic or systematic way. So by creating a flow chart of a process, we can also ideate to find gaps. Well, we want to go from point A to point B, and we do a flow chart and we find we are missing something in the detailed process to get to B, and that missing something, that gap, can create an opportunity for innovation. Another approach to brainstorming and innovation is what's called a SWOT analysis. SWOT, as you know from your business classes, is strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And SWOT analysis is typically used in strategy, but it can also be used in innovation analysis. So it's a summary tool that allows you to analyze the internal aspects of a company or your organization, as well as the external factors addressing the success of that business. So the internal factors are the strengths and weaknesses of the business. So we highlight those: favorable, unfavorable, strengths and weaknesses. And then the external opportunities and the external threats. And we tabulate all those in this 2x2 box. And that creates, again, segments or areas that we can ideate or innovate. Another approach is called starbursting. And if you remember from the lecture or seminar that I shared with you about global mindset, I use starbursting as an organizational framework to ideate and come up with the different dimensions of global mindset: the what, the where, the when, the why, the how, and the who related to ideation. So instead of directly discussing solutions, starbursting allows you to examine the problem by asking 6 key questions, and other questions too as necessary. So these are the 6 key questions around the problem. Notice that there's some similarities to the mind map, but it's more around questions than necessarily information structure. So you remember the Next Rise video, Go Global, and I talked about the who, the what, the where, the when, the why, the how, and that was in this video. I'm not going to present it today, but you saw it already in last week's seminar. So affinity diagrams are similar to mind maps. They allow you to arrange and group ideas. So instead of a map, it's more like a table. So what are the problems associated with the staff, the distribution, the quality, the capacity. These are affinity diagrams. So you can imagine the Oxford team is saying, well, we have this vaccine project. How can we distribute it? How can we manufacture it? Who are the partners that we can do? What are the projects that we can do to fill in these gaps to go from the initial idea to the final outcome? And then concept maps are also used in learning and teaching to identify relationships between ideas and concepts. So for example, we have a course, we can have the assignments, the online tools, learning theory, we have different theories, group work, scaffolding, discussion. These are all the different concepts that are related to the concept of teaching a course. Another important principle of ideation is TRIZ. TRIZ is a technique of predicting future technologies. So technologies often evolve in a predictable fashion. So you have an immobile system, for example, eventually having more degrees of freedom, ultimately becoming an energetic based system. So for example, a rigid steering wheel will have more and more components, ultimately to electrical steering. A single leaf, simple door will ultimately be a Star Wars style light lock. We have that in medicine. So the present paradigm in medicine is a matter on matter paradigm. A drug has to bind physically to a protein. The surgical device or hand has to physically interact with the body tissues and cavities and so forth. But the future will be some sort of energy matter concept where this energy is interacting with these proteins. In other words, a device that acts like a drug. So I mentioned to you in the last lecture about the virtual medicine, virtual terahertz medicine institute that I did while I was at Samsung, using the global research outreach and working with the Samsung staff members to engage with outside universities to create that, help move forward this concept of the future. So this is, very difficult to predict future technologies, but this actually argues that there are certain patterns. So for example, you might have a train. Well, trains have gotten faster and faster. Trains have gotten more and more efficient. Trains have gotten cleaner and cleaner energy sources. So we can think about what would be the next cleaner energy source? What would be the next faster train? What would be the next quieter train? We know that that's how technology progresses, and that those evolutionary directions can help predict ideas or stimulate ideas to achieve those necessarily more advanced incarnations of the technology. Now, we talked very important, and this was in the Booz Allen study, about the connection between the customer, the connection with the market. And this is Satya Nadella, the Microsoft CEO. Empathy, or understanding the customer, understanding other people more generally, makes you a better innovator. So an empathy map, so you get the group together like Mikhail mentioned and says, let's imagine the customer. What does the customer say? What does the customer think? What does the customer do, and what does the customer feel? And based on this, we can finally find the needs and the insights of your user. So say, think, feel, and do. This is an empathy map. So the final method, which kind of brings these together, and is probably the most comprehensive and powerful method of innovation, is what we call design thinking. In design thinking, we start with empathy. We talked about that. Say, do, think, and feel. We try to understand the user. And based on that empathy map, we define the problem. And then we use other techniques to ideate, such as the reverse fishbone, looking at the negative idea, the mind map, the affinity diagrams. We ideate, so we bring that technique in. Then we prototype and we test. So we test that idea in the market. We test that with a focus group. We test that with nature, if it's a scientific research and so forth. So this design thinking approach is fundamental for, or perhaps the most comprehensive and most advanced of these techniques or methods of innovation. Another approach is business model canvas. So you outline for the business model, the key partners, the key activities, the value propositions, customer relations, customer segments, channels, resources, revenue streams, cost structure. You approach this from a very business perspective and use these categories, a kind of affinity diagram, if you will, focused on business models to generate ideas to fill these gaps. Another approach is crowdsourcing. I gave you this example from Facebook where I talked about how these solar panels are reflecting lights and interfering with the pilots. But if solar power is intended to absorb light, why don't we come up with different ideas to both solve both problems, get more light, more energy, but also prevent the glare that interferes with pilots and makes it dangerous to fly. So there were 35 comments and all these people, friends of mine, commented on the possible solutions and ideas and so forth. So it was a kind of form of crowdsourcing. And crowdsourcing is very important. That's why we talk about curiosity, observation, passion. I'm basically crowdsourcing all sorts of different ideas through your assignments. It's a form of crowdsourcing. You bring in different webinars, you bring in different observations, you bring in different passion, and that's related to this theory of innovation that we talked about. And finally, cross-industry innovation. In cross-industry innovation, this was a conference at NASA back in 2016 that I attended. So NASA obviously flies to Mars and the moon, and they send spaceships and all this, but they had people from all sorts of industries, from cosmetics to real estate to trucking to medicine, all combining together to come up with different ideas to drive innovation at NASA. So what we're going to do now is just practice a little bit of this ideation concept. I don't think we have 30 minutes for brainstorming, so we might make it 20 minutes. So we're going to get into 6 groups. We're actually going to have maybe 7 or 8 people in each group. So I will create a breakout group here. And you'll do 20 minutes of brainstorming. We'll start at 11:15 and end at around 11:35. And the question will be, how can we combat the third wave of COVID? And then each group will come back and we'll do a 2-minute presentation by each group, and you'll summarize your ideas then. Sound like a plan? So again, this is just, you can use whatever method. You can use a starbursting, you can use just discussion, you can use design thinking, whatever it is in your group. Just again, to experience this concept of brainstorming in your own, in this class, we're going to do this short exercise just as a matter of sort of practical experience. Any questions?
Are we supposed to create groups by ourselves?
No, I'm going to create them.
Okay,
randomly. So I have here create breakout rooms. And let's create 6 breakout rooms. I will assign automatically the 8 to 9 participants. And you just gather together, talk in the breakout room about this concept of how can we combat the third wave of COVID? If there is one. You know, India has a very serious problem because we don't have vaccine in Korea. Basically, we couldn't make the deals with the outside. We weren't comfortable with that and so forth. We're dealing with this situation. How can we prevent this potential third wave? So I will create this and then you'll come back at 11:35 and then we'll do a very quick 2-minute presentation by each group. Okay, let's continue.